Greetings all! Yes, it's time for another exciting episode of Randomly Pepper the Chieftain with questions. As ever, questions mainly come from the appropriate Patreon tier, but I occasionally go back to YouTube comments and the like to tackle anything else interesting which may pop up. I am happy to say that there is now a consolidated list of Q&A questions in the past. So if you're looking for anything in particular, or to see if a question has been asked previously, look for the link in the video description below. To start though, it is t-shirt time. Yes, this time it's Bob Semple who gets the nod due to popular demand. Basically, I put a survey out on Patreon and it's one of the two that came up. The other one was, if you recall, the T28. There you go. Now what I've told Everpress to do is basically just turn on all the old t-shirts. So they've been made available for reprinting if you missed it in the past. And hopefully you should be able to ease up on shipping and handling if you're looking for more than one t-shirt and you just do it in one order. So it's all the previous ones: T28, Tank is on fire, Drive Me Closer, Significant Emotional Event, all the catchphrases. If you have any particular requests, go ahead and put it down below if there's something that you have in mind. And of course, it's also the mugs and hoodies are also still available. You'll be able to see it, or at least you should, just below the video. Anyway, going back to the last video, as many people pointed out in the discussion on boxer or flat engines, I did miss a really bloody obvious one, the T64. Anyway, now on to this month's questions. And I'm going to start off with Loch Ness Hamster. You feel something impact your tank and the interior fills with smoke. What's the immediate procedure? Well, I had two what the F was that moments in Iraq. One was the loss of an idler wheel whilst trundling along at about 20 miles an hour. And you can imagine that the end result of the track dropping under the support arms was kind of disturbing. Bizarre banging noises, tank loses control, required counter steer, and stop. Obviously the first thought was a mine or some such, but there was no smoke. So we stayed inside to assess the situation for a moment, bearing in mind that tanks don't operate alone, so we did have cover from behind from the wing tank. And when we concluded that we were not actually under fire or other sort of attack, we got out to have a look to see what happened. So we discovered, oh yeah, the idler fell off. The other was a response to contact, so there's actually a fight going on, we're going to it, and in the middle of our response, a massive loud bang. And to this day, we have absolutely no idea what it was about. So both myself and the gunner thought it was an RPG. Not that we knew any better because we'd never been hit by an RPG before, but it sounded like the sort of thing that would sound like if you were hit by an RPG. Again though, no smoke. So we basically sat in the tank for a moment to figure out what was going on. Then after checking the tank, and then us of course, couldn't find anything wrong and we just went on to continue mission. Neither of those two incidents had smoke. So what happens if there is smoke? Well, first you need to verify that A, the smoke is actually caused by a fire, and B, that the fire is still going. Because don't forget that the M1 has a fire suppression system inside the crew compartment, it's halon. If it goes off, well, gas gets vented from the bottles into the compartment and should, in theory, smother the fire. You do want to open the hatches and get some air at that point, but you can also do a quick assessment to see whether or not it worked. If there is still a little burning, you can grab a handheld out of the sponson box. Obviously at that point you then need to make an assessment to see if the tank can still operate or not. The other thing to check, of course, before you stick your head out of the top, is that the ammo isn't burning in the compartment behind you, although I suspect you will notice that fairly quickly. We did actually have a halon bottle go off by accident in the middle of one of our road marches. It sort of blew out onto the driver's hatch. He didn't suffocate. He did actually get a bit of a cold burn on the shoulder. J. When is it appropriate to give measurements such as armor or guns in millimeters versus centimeters? It often seems that millimeters is used even though it would seem that centimeters might be more appropriate for the value given, such as 200 millimeters versus 20 centimeters. Honestly, I think it's just a case of institutional inertia. It started with millimeters, because that was just kind of how thick the armor was, and just as the numbers got bigger, they didn't change the standard. That said, I have a personal policy of using whatever measurement was used by the originating documentation, so the German 88 is really an 8.8 centimeters. American vehicles usually come measured in freedom units, and so I'll give measurements that way. But even then, you'll notice that if a caliber is European sourced, such as the 75mm on Sherman or the 40mm anti-aircraft gun, they will actually use the millimeter designation, and so on. So using millimeters instead of centimeters isn't wrong, it's just a matter of personal taste. Hammer of Terror. The book Troop Leader by Bill Bellamy makes reference to a so-called training Cromwell, which ended up on the front lines but was produced of thinner unarmored steel instead of plate armor. Is any of this remotely plausible? Yes. Likely? No. But certainly plausible, and I've been doing this long enough to know that saying it would never happen is a recipe for being proven wrong later. Besides, it is such an odd thing to claim, it's likely true just for that reason. Regular steel, i.e. unarmored vehicles, were absolutely built. This was a common thing amongst multiple countries. After all, armoring your steel is expensive and difficult, and when you're simply trying to figure out if a tank works and is the right shape and so on, there's no need to make it reinforced armor when you're building the tank. Now, these likely would not have been training tanks, but prototypes and pre-production models. Now, for obvious reasons, one would not want to mix up a soft steel prototype with a service vehicle, and such vehicles would normally be marked. See the words mild steel welded on the side of this T-43, for example. The British used a red triangular cast metal plate attached to the vehicle. You can see it on Valiant and Tortoise. One would think that such a plate would be noticed by the crew. Of course, I guess it could always fall off or be removed by some malicious person. So could a pre-production tank be sent to a line unit by accident? Yeah, it's theoretically possible, not likely. As for some of the other descriptions in the book, such as low caliber ammunition being embedded, well, that's entirely possible with both armored and unarmored steel. There are plenty of test reports of ammunition embedded in armor. And if you look closely at the IS-2 in the American Heritage Museum near Boston, or maybe you pull out some good old photos that you might have taken of the tank when it was at Overloon, you will see a number of small caliber cannon rounds embedded into the armor. I think it's like 23mm. So I'm not going to say that that's a defining characteristic of a mild steel vehicle. It all comes down to distance, angle, and metal composition. I'm similarly a little suspicious of the idea that the vehicle was lighter because it was mild steel and thus could jump further and dodge faster. Some engines simply are better tuned than others. You take two theoretically identical tanks, line them up next to each other and have a drag race, you are going to end up with a winner and a loser. I'm not convinced that an inch of unarmored steel masses any notable amount less than an inch of armored steel. I suspect the difference is more in composition than density. It would also be pretty silly for trials vehicles to test the automotive components with a vehicle notably less heavy than a service vehicle would be. Thus, even if they did have an unarmored Cromwell, I'm not sure that the vehicle was faster because of it. It may have been for other reasons. Saskia, any trips to Switzerland planned? No. I'm booked out for this year and pretty much next year. Any plans to do a video on Israeli armor doctrine? Not particularly. I have downloaded some English translations of what may be Israeli doctrine, but I haven't had the time to dig into them yet. And if I recall, these are kind of like point-in-time doctrinal documents, not a full history over time like the videos I was doing for the World War II channel. I may yet, by the way, revisit those for a mid-war update. What do I think of the Swiss Army still using Leopard 2A4s? Aren't they a little bit obsolescent? It is true that the Panzer 87s are getting a little bit long in the tooth. However, the Swiss are aware of this, and RUAG took a look at upgrading the vehicle. Their overall proposal was fairly significant to include armor packages and a remote weapons station. However, though the armor packages at least can be fairly quickly added, the Swiss have decided not to actually upgrade their vehicles to that level. Instead, the Panzer 87 Wertehaltung, or more commonly the Panzer 87 WE, is only a partial upgrade. This started in the mid-2000s and consists mainly of fitting the commander's independent viewer with a thermal imager, improving the controls of that viewer, and adding the Vehicle Integrated Information Navigation Command Control System. the Swiss Army's battlefield management system. In addition, they also purchased the DM-53 APF-SDS round, which is about as good as you can get without going to depleted uranium right now. It's not the end of the line, it seems, for Swiss Leopards. They originally acquired 380 of them. There were currently 134 in service. 90 were sold off, a bunch of others were converted to specialty vehicles, and the rest, at least 96, are sitting in storage. These were not upgraded to WE standard. However, in the last month or so, there have been rumblings that it may not be a bad idea to pull a few of them out of storage, the number being thrown around being 3 dozen, and upgrading those. RUAG has developed a much more complete upgrade package demonstrated in 2016, which may interest the Swiss, or may not. Either way, the Panzer 87 was in service for just under 20 years when it received its first midlife upgrade, so with the next 2-decade mark coming up fast, you never know. Sean Davis, is there any particular reason as to why tanks aren't often seen turning on a dime, one track forwards and one backwards? In videos, I only see tracked vehicles turning with one track moving forward in reverse and the other not moving at all. Alright, you're talking about pivot steer versus neutral steer. Pivot steer is locking one track and pivoting around it. Neutral steer is a steer with no bias, so the tank spins in place. Abrams and Bradley crews, I don't care that the position for the transmission selector is called pivot. It's still a neutral steer as per TC 3-21.60. Yes, I know the -10 for the vehicle says a pivot turn is a turn in its own length, but the training circular is correct and the terminology is common in worldwide usage. Anyway, the first reason you may see a vehicle pivot steering instead of neutral steering is that the vehicle simply may not be capable of the latter. Now, the capability has theoretically been around since World War I on some tanks and became a lot more common in World War II, but even then, vehicles continued to be built with only a pivot steer capability. The venerable M113, for example, only received neutral steer capability with the A3 and its steering wheel. Earlier versions used tillers for normal turns, and for pivot steer, what they had were actually labeled pivot steer handles, and those applied a disc brake to lock that track. Most Soviet-designed vehicles, to include T-72 and T-90 tanks, are still not being built with a neutral steer capability. It makes the transmission more complicated, more expensive, and is something of a nice to have. Another reason you may not see it is simply to reduce wear and tear. It's worth noting that Panther crews were instructed to not neutral steer if at all possible, to limit breakdown possibilities. Thirdly, it's terrain dependent. Ordinarily, you want to only neutral steer on good ground because as the tack is sliding, it's also dragging up dirt into the track system and providing friction. You want to do it only on solid ground or concrete. One will note that on a modern gunnery range, there is usually a concrete turning pad behind the firing points to allow the tanks to spin in place without damage to the ground or the tracks. Fourthly, it takes longer to neutral steer and then go into gear than to simply put the track into drive and hold one track. When you're pointing in the right direction, you just straighten the controls and off you go. Only in very tight terrain do you really need to spin in place. Fortunately, that terrain often is also packed ground or concrete in built-up areas, or maybe in the motor pool, so it works out nicely. Stephen Britton wonders about fuel tank levels. He says that in the civilian vehicle transport world, vehicles have as little fuel as possible to minimize fire risk. Do military transport vehicles work the same way? I can't speak for transport specifically, but it was standard for us to fill the tanks to the brim when you were done with them. The risk of fume explosion, you think TWA 800, was considered greater than the risk of fire from the fuel. And if you think about the size of an AFV's fuel tank, remember the M1 carries 500 gallons in its tanks, that's a hell of a lot of space for fumes to accumulate to create a fuel-air explosion. It's actually come up for Wargaming at shows. On occasion, we will rent a tank for a stand at a trade show, but the rules from the fire marshals are usually made with more normal cars and trucks in mind. Things with 20 to 50 gallon tanks. Trying to explain that fuel tanks are an entirely different kettle of fish seems, and thus far, to have fallen upon deaf ears. Though in hindsight, I guess we probably could have just left the fuel caps open to allow the fumes to escape. I'll also note that it was standard that when I was done flying and parking the airplane for the fuel tanks to be filled before leaving the airport. John Kettner, congratulations! GM has created the mighty Bolo Mark I at last. Marks 2 and 3 are coming off the line, and you've been given the honour of commanding a battalion of the new tanks. Would you prefer your personal tank to be a Mark II or a Mark III? Well, we're going back in time here since the Mark II entered service 7 years ago and the Mark III 4 years ago. However, as a battalion commander, I would go with the Mark II. Lighter, faster, I can get to where I can best control the battle. Also, I wouldn't have to worry myself about utilising the capabilities of the Mark III's VLS systems. VLS system. That's one of those things like ATM machines, isn't it? Vertical launch system. Anyway, if I had to worry about those systems, that could be a little bit limiting. So, for example, a Mark III could be used as a point defense system, which kind of holds you in place. A Mark II is designed for one role only, direct fire engagement. So let the larger firepower vehicles be run by crews who only need to fight, not to command. Besides, the Concordia was made by a Mark II basically, so it has to have something going for it. Sworn brother of the Ballistic Order of St. John Moses Browning. I've seen several photos of M48s in Vietnam on which the crews have welded an improvised mount with an M2 instead of cupola. How does the US Army feel about such DIY modifications to a tank? Are there good ones, and if so, has the Army decided to adopt them officially? Not just one, I've seen one tank with a twin machine gun mount. Well, Windwalker is correct that the Cullens cutter would be another such example, as would the sandbag rails used by 7th Armoured. Ditto the wooden planks on Pacific Theatre Shermans or the welded plates on the road wheels of Stuarts. Infantry telephones on the back of Shermans were originally bodged field modifications before the Army came up with an official version. In the case of the M48s, the problem was that the cupola was designed for operation in slightly more open terrain than the tanks were being used in Vietnam. So that's the why. Obviously, the welding would have been done by Ordnance Branch folks at the request of the crews. It seems likely that no higher approval would have been necessary, and that there would always be some bright spark who first comes up with an idea at lower levels. Consider the field armoured Humvees of 2004, or the gun trucks, also of Vietnam or Iraq. I'm trying to think of some field applied modification to the M1 which garnered full approval, and the closest thing I can think of is the use of the front left of the Abrams to stow a road wheel. The bolts that you find, the 4 bolts, they're actually used for lifting the turret, not stowing wheels, and the troops were damaging the threads inside the turret when they tried mounting the road wheels. Instead of telling the troops to stop doing it, the solution was basically to develop new bolts specifically for mounting the road wheels without damaging the threads inside the turret. Perhaps the ultimate idea of a troop modification to a tank is the British Street Fighter program. They basically put a tank at the disposal of the troops and said, "Okay lads, if you could modify the tank, what would you do to it?" Some of the ideas, to me at least, seem pretty silly, like mounting a twin brimstone missile on the top. But maybe I'm missing something in the capabilities. It seems to me that they're trying to get the tank to do everything itself instead of relying on friends. However, I am not read in on the test reports, so who knows. Ed A to Z wondered about the concept of a tank resupply vehicle. Maybe an ammo hauler, where the vehicle connects to the back of the turret of the tank. Such vehicles do exist for artillery. Consider the M992 FASV, which basically has a conveyor to the back of the M109. However, no such vehicle exists for tanks to my knowledge. For it to work for a tank, unless you're pushing rounds in through an ammo port and turret side, you probably want a tank with a bustle autoloader like Leclerc or Type 90. It should be possible to create an automated loading system which pushes ammo forward into the bustle and then for the autoloader to move around to a storage position. However, since we're only talking 40 or so rounds, I'm not sure it's entirely worth it. A simpler system was developed for the M1, which of course is manually loaded. On some tanks built around the 1990s, you will see 3 attachment points on the top of the blow-off panels. These were very annoying because they ruined a perfectly good sleeping location. The theory was that the ammo rack was attached to the blow-off panel. When it came time to rearm, a vehicle with a crane would come along, simply lift the empty ammo rack straight up, and replace it with another ammo rack which had a full load of ammunition. I'm looking at it, the model actually has them. The idea never entered service in the end. I guess the army just didn't think it was worth it. Felicity Longus. If the US had continued on with Operation Downfall, what projects being worked on would likely have been continued? Would US tank development have continued to be dictated by the demands of the ETO, or would tank development have been put on the back burner because of the type of fighting that Downfall would have seen? This, of course, is the invasion of the Japanese Home Islands. I don't think that there would have been any particular change. The new generations of vehicle, to include Pershing and Hellcat, were starting to arrive in the Pacific. But really, what would be happening that the Shermans wouldn't have been perfectly capable of dealing with? I'm reminded of the use of Shermans but 5 years later in Korea, and they worked fine. In the meantime, the joys of the peace alongside the USSR pretty soon changed to, hang on, maybe we're going to have to deal with these guys no matter what happens in Japan. So the US's tank development undoubtedly would have continued regardless, simply to face the Soviets. Admiral Tiberius, why did the British stick with the multi-fuel engine for so long? Especially when Chieftains was so notoriously unreliable? And did the multi-fuel capability have any practical benefits? Oddly, I was talking to a Chieftain crewman the other day and he was saying that with the Mark 13 L60 upgrade, it was quite reliable. Make of that what you will, but we are talking early 1980s here. In any case, the decision to fit Chieftain with a multi-fuel engine came about in 1957. There's some grand European multinational plan that the British government got on board with, but for whatever reason, only the British really tried to run with it. The L60 wasn't a true multi-fuel in the same manner that the turbine in the M1 is. You would have to drain the fuel tanks of whatever was in it at the time, then the Remy mechanics would have to fiddle with the engine for up to 8 hours before it could then run on whatever new fuel type you had. Of course, in reality, the British just ran their Chieftains on diesel like everybody else, except with a big cloud of blue smoke following the tank everywhere. It wasn't the only such multi-fuel engine that entered service. The American M35 Deuce and a Half and the 54 5-ton, for example, also came with a multi-fuel. At least as long as you mix a little bit of diesel in with it, you can run it without preparation. Technically, it was a hypercycle engine. The technology was developed by MAN. However, the idea of multi-fuel was certainly present in US thinking as early as the early 1950s. Part of the reason that the US moved to diesel engines was because they were usually fairly simple to modify to a multi-fuel capability if necessary. There was a concern that there would be a shortage of diesel because of the sudden increase in diesel use from anything else from locomotives on railways to ships. So the Army required all its diesels to be able to operate on CITE fuel as well. CITE is compression ignition turbine engine, and it's a form of JP4 jet fuel. The AVCR 1100-2 for the MBT-70 project was another multi-fuel type using a variable compression ratio, hence VCR in the name. As a result, it can be argued that with the move to the turbine for the M1, the US kept with multi-fuel for decades. I should add, the US looked very hard at anything. There's even discussion of the merits of steam engines, which notably are multi-fuel. The report concluded that despite the various advantages of steam turbines, to include stupidly good torque ratings, they tended to be space inefficient, have a poor conversion rate of energy, and were a little bit heavy for the horsepower. In any case, the hypercycle truck engines were eventually reconfigured or replaced to just run on diesel, and today pretty much everything just runs off of JP8, which is technically a form of jet fuel, but the compression engines seem to run them anyway. Alexander H. Can I elaborate on the development of Soviet tank ammo during the Cold War? Not particularly, no. I don't seem to have anything to hand which isn't freely available online. Sorry. Tankax wants to know about the spall shields on US turrets. He's seen documents that state that the M26 had a mantlet protection of 8-inch in basis, which implies a nearly 9-centimeter spall shield just behind the gun shield. This might also explain Honeycutt's claim that the T-29 mantlet was 279 millimeters when I measured it as only about 203. He's always theorized that this was just Honeycutt taking into account the spall shield inside the T-29 turret. Can I impart any thoughts on this? T-29's mantlet was about 8 inches over most of it, but it was in a ring closer to the gun itself. It actually measured the full 280 millimeters or so. I would also point out, though, that I've seen some documents in the archives rating T-29 as both 8 inches and whatever the 280 comes out as. I accept that ordinarily one needs to calibrate for the exact material being measured by my ultrasonic gauge that I was using, but the different types of steel are likely close enough for ballpark estimates. And besides, I also tried a slightly more old school method to confirm the readings. However, the shield inside really is just a spall shield with reinforcing ribs. Indeed, I'm not even sure it's technically a spall shield as much as a mounting system for the gun components, which happen to have a secondary shielding function to a small extent. The metal just seemed too thin to me. I'm also suspicious that it would be made of armored steel. I'd also observe that the inner shield, such as it is for an M4, is also sufficiently thin that I don't think it contributes all that much to the ballistic protection properties. As to the Pershing with the 8-inch basis, I'm wondering if you're referring to the T26E2, which entered service as the M45. As the 105mm gun on that tank was much shorter than the 90mm, they needed to put more weight forward of the trunnions in order to balance it. And that turned out to be about 8 inches worth of armor. S-Face wants to know, if the US entered a draft, has the percentage of bodies that goes to each branch of the army been decided? Also, how long would training take for a draftee to become qualified as fit for combat in an armored unit? I'm sure that such figures have already been calculated, but I have no idea what the percentages might be. Obviously, we have World War II to draw upon as a precedent, and draftees were given assessments upon accession, much like we run the ASRAB today, to determine what sorts of jobs you may be good at. The technical services always tended to get first pick, the Army Air Forces, Ordnance, Engineers, and so on. Tankers, as I recall, were somewhere in the middle, and the infantry were down at the bottom. This may explain the quoted statistic that German infantry were better than US infantry on a one-for-one basis. But on the other hand, US infantry only needed to be able to get on the radio net maintained by the more intelligent signal corps troopers and call in a strike by the even more intelligent artillery and aviation guys. So it worked out. It's another example as to why you need to be very, very careful about taking comparative statistics in isolation and out of larger context. As for how long it would take a draftee to become qualified, the official answer is presumably 22 weeks, which is how long it takes to consider a current volunteer as being qualified to go to a line unit. In actuality, of course, I suspect a couple of weeks might be able to be shaved off if they had to. Okay, it's been absent for a while, but it's time for Gun of the Month. I have shown the SIG P365 SAS before, but it has been replaced as my everyday carry in favor of the 365 XL with the Holosun sight. And I am told, I mean, you can see the difference in size when it's decidedly a bit bigger than the other. Now, I am told that when they started designing the 365 series, they actually started with the magazine, because that was sort of the trick to getting such a large capacity. So you take the magazine from the XL and it fits into the SAS, the smaller version. Now it's the smaller version, smaller magazine for the XL is considered the extended magazine for the SAS. So there is actually a longer version. So this is a 12 round, you can get a 14 round, which sticks out a little bit. And I have found it sticks out a little bit too much for the purposes of staying concealed. So I just run with the 12. I mean, 13 rounds, it's enough to deal with most things. And of course, being larger with a frame, you can put an optic on it. Upon reading all the various reviews, the Holosun is winning. I've only fired it a few times. It seems to do exactly what it says on the tin. Another advantage to the XL is that you actually have proper external controls instead of the anti-snag system here. I mean, yeah, you could still use this as a pocket gun or something, you know, for when you don't want to have to wear a proper holster. Just get a little pocket holster. But I think the 365 SES is actually more of a specialist pistol, and I'm just going to run this. I mean, there are other channels that will give you a much more thorough breakdown of the 365 internal striker system. It does exactly what it says on the tin. I mean, I can't complain. It's 13 rounds of 9mm that doesn't get in your way. So there we go. The other thing I've noticed actually with, and this kind of happened with the SAS as well, is that I tend to wear the holster routinely, whether or not there's a weapon in it, simply because it keeps my trousers from falling down. So every time I go out, let's say I'm going to carry the sidearm, I holster the weapon, and it's actually starting to affect the finish already, even though it's pretty brand new, which is a little bit surprising. But no matter. So there you go. Gun of the month is another SIG. I like SIGs. I did another weapons qual incidentally with the M17, so it's my second weapons qual with it, which is the, if you're not tracking, it's the Army's replacement for the Beretta. I can't complain. I mean, honestly, I didn't have any complaints about the Beretta either. The Beretta did exactly what it was supposed to do. Just they were getting a little bit old. And the M17, I mean, it puts rounds more or less where you want them to go, and I do like the modular grip size. But anyway, would I buy one personally? Don't see a need to. The Army lets me shoot them. If I didn't have them from the Army, would I get a SIG M17? Probably. It works. I have other things on my shopping list though, when I have the money to buy them. Thunderchild. Opinion on giraffe or cherry picker style ATGM vehicles. Basically a tank chassis with a large arm instead of a conventional turret with a missile launcher on top. The basic concept goes back quite a few years, famously the praying mantis machine gun carrier of the British. Of course, it didn't take too long for people to realize that it might be worth putting missiles on top instead of a machine gun. Such designs often came with a giraffe arm. Prototypes were built and trialed over the various years. One of the earliest was the M113 elevated anti-tank missile launcher, which was basically a twin launcher on the end of a very long boom, about 1972. The problem with that was that the launcher could only be reloaded from outside the vehicle, which was considered an undesirable trait. Eventually, the hammerhead, as found on the M901 ITV, was selected. It may not have been quite as high, but it seemed to be high enough, especially if you take into account the issues of complication and weight. Indeed, the complication of the elevating mechanism versus need seems to be the main reason such things haven't been adopted, at least as far as I can determine. Certainly such systems have entered service for surveillance purposes and are commonly found with radars and cameras on top, and some of them do seem to approach the weights of a missile system. The most recent attempt in the West seems to be by a Danish company called Falk Schmidt. Their elevated tow system 2 was trialed in the late 1990s. If it has entered service anywhere, I can't seem to find a reference to it, but the company website says that over 150 have been built. Make of that what you will. The most recent example I can find was a concept vehicle from China, the GT6 from 10 years ago. Near as I can tell, if you really need to fire a missile from high up, there are aircraft which can do it. And if all you want to do is just keep your vehicle hidden, a normal hammerhead and the like will do adequately. Ralph over on the Panzer Museum website on YouTube has a full half hour on the subject, as they happen to have one of these prototype giraffe missile vehicles in their collection. I'll put a link to the video below. The catch is that it's in German and there are no English translations, so only 4% of you, according to my YouTube analytics, will be able to understand it. I am not one of that 4%. Reichsbeerminister, regarding the God damn it, haven't those Muppets learned anything? Question, how could the Schar B1 and the lack of optics for German gunners and their tanks happen? I have no answer to the German optics question. They obviously were very well aware of the concept and simply chose not to implement them on their turreted vehicles. I have seen no explanation as to why. As for the B1, I think it was just a matter of the sunk cost fallacy. Remember, the B1 is in effect a 1920s design with a long development process caused, not least, by the question of whether heavy tanks would be banned by treaty. The French put a lot of time, effort and money into the design over the years. The lack of visibility for the crew was noted in pre-acceptance trials of the later 1930s, but it seemed that as the best heavy tank design that the French had, arguably the only heavy French design available, somewhere notwithstanding, it was go with the B1 or start over from scratch. And it seems that the French didn't think that starting over was a viable option given the time constraints, and well, even though it was known that the B1 was really just an interim tank, the order was placed anyway while improvements were developed. Such proposed solutions, such as a 12-degree range of traverse for the hull gun and a better turret, were planned for the B1 Terre. But of course the invasion of France put paid to both that and to the prototypes. There was one last proposal, the B40, which was basically a derivative of the Terre, but that never made it to completion. Big D. There has been a lot of discussion recently about the effectiveness of Molotov cocktails against modern AFVs. How effective are they against modern armor? Also, is there an "oh bugger, the tank is on fire" drill for the M1? As to Molotovs, not very. The best bet might be if you can get it to land on an air intake and have the filters start to burn, but I suspect the airflow would have as good a chance of snuffing out the flame. The assessments seem to be that the advantage to setting a vehicle alight, and remember it's really just a superficial burning on the outside of the armor, is that it distracts the crew, usually keeps them bottled up, and may prevent them from noticing, or simply obscure, a follow-on attack by someone armed with something a little bit more dangerous. And I seem to recall I talked about napalm tests on the Pershing, and napalm didn't have much of an effect. So you can imagine that a Molotov cocktail probably wouldn't. However, if the hatches are open, then you're talking about an entirely different kettle of fish, and vehicles can be knocked out. In my day, M1 crews were indeed tested on the "oh bugger, the tank is on fire" drill. In actuality, it was officially named Tank Crew Gunnery Skills Test Station Number 13 Crew Evacuation. The crew would have 28 seconds to perform the designated actions, which included the TC traversing the turret to the left so the driver could get out, the loader stowing the ammo door switch, and the gunner disconnecting the fuel line quick disconnect coupling, and then getting 30 yards from the tank. Interestingly, though it's in the FM 3-20.12 of 2005, which would have been valid for the last time I fired a tank, I do not see the test in the current TC 3-20.12. Apparently, it is no longer tested. Robert Henry Ulston. As a former TC who rode around with various important bits exposed, what would I have preferred to have quick access to at the hatch? A heavy machine gun like the 50 cal? A lighter machine gun in 7.62 or 5.56, or maybe a light cannon? Or perhaps something a bit more exotic like an automatic grenade launcher?
There, the red one.
Believe it or not, the rifle would have done me fine. If you think about it, if it's something that I'm really worried about killing, or at least suppressing right the hell now, it's probably very close. At longer ranges, sure, the 50 cal will do nicely, but you can imagine driving along in this sort of terrain. Even the loader's Skate 240 can't react as quickly and has the same range of elevation and depression as it takes to spin with a light shoulder-fired rifle. Keep the target from killing you just long enough for your buddy with a better angle behind to finish the job, or for you to get some distance between you and the threat. As a result, I normally rode with my rifle to my right between the hatch and the sponson box. It would take some pretty serious off-roading for the rifle to fall off. Kazuki K with the usual twofer. Some tanks have smoke launchers in a single row, others have a cluster. Any reason why? Not that I can think of. The cluster seems to take up less real estate, and I'm not sure I can think of a downside to them other than maybe being a little bit more difficult to produce. I guess it may be possible to individually aim launchers that are mounted in a single row, maybe if you want to have a smaller, thicker arc coverage at the front or some such. As for fusing, which you asked about, vehicle grenades normally start smoking as soon as they're fired. Modern ones come in two categories, either ones which arc upwards and then they create a curtain on the way down before continuing to smoke, or those which are fired outwards and explode. With the current goings on in Ukraine, this is the second question, will that affect work or museum visits with Russia? Well, I strongly doubt that there will be any more visits for me to Kubinka or Patriot Park in the next decade, unless there is a dramatic change in government in Russia. For now, Belarus is similarly on the no-go list. For those who are not keeping track, my civilian employer, Wargaming.net, has severed all ties with Russia and Belarus, and it has moved to being an entirely Western company. Given that the employees of our large Ukrainian office are a little bit distracted right now, the main development center seems to be in Vilnius. There has been little effect on my end. We are still planning trips to do more filming at musea in North America and other Western countries, and we have indeed filmed more which are yet to be edited and released. For those who don't actually follow it, I only tend to cross-post certain notable wargaming videos, such as Inside the Chieftain's Hatch, and those usually come out on Wednesdays. There are a good number of my historical videos which are only on the World of Tanks North America channel. Grim. Did anything come out of the MGV NLOS vehicles and why were they cancelled? MGV was the manned ground vehicle. For those not keeping track, the US is currently working on the optionally manned combat vehicle, but MGV was manned. It was supposed to be a lightweight series of vehicles. Yes, even the XM1202 mounted combat system, which was supposed to replace the M1, was a lighter vehicle, and they all used a common chassis which used a diesel hybrid powertrain. Officially, the weight limit was about 20 tons. The reality led to it being closer to 30. The NLOS variant, non-line of sight cannon, which was the only one to actually be made, had a two-man crew, an autoloader, obviously an advanced fire control system and other goodies. The program was cancelled officially for cost reasons, although I suspect also because it was a stupid idea. You can't replace a 70-ton M1 with a 25-ton vehicle that looks suspiciously like the CV90-120, of which basically none have been sold. Did anything come of it? No idea, I've not seen the test reports. Do I think MRAPs are going to stay in inventory or will they be slowly phased out in favour of smaller, lighter vehicles? I suspect the MATVs are going to hang around for a while yet. The older RGs and Cayman vehicles are all but gone, as they really were just road vehicles with armour. The MATV was designed to be a little bit more off-road capable. The JLTV is so stupidly big, partially because it's supposed to have a good amount of the MATV's resilience. But the bottom line is that the US was caught short-handed once before on IED-resistant vehicles, and MATVs in particular are expensive enough pieces of kit with quite a few miles left in them, which are not incompetent off-road. Overall, the Army bought about 25,000 MRAPs. The last figure I saw had about 8,500 of them retained, of which 5,600 were MATVs and the remaining 3,000 or so were Max Pro Dashes. Some 5,000 of these were placed in pre-positioned stocks around the world, just in case. Sebastian Cranen. In Red Storm Rising, TC Sergeant McCall calls "Target tank, 12 o'clock, Sabo, shoot," as he orders the gunner to engage, as well as "hit" when the target was hit. Was this the proper engagement phraseology for the period? Or is it simply a minor inaccuracy in an otherwise well-researched book? Well, it seems that the phraseology hasn't changed much over time. You can find the gunnery manual for 1961 available easily online, FM 17-12, and the verbiage is extremely similar to modern use, with the main exception being that sensings don't need to be called unless appropriate. They are considered a mental exercise. A sensing is the assessment of where did the round go. The sequence in that manual is alert, ammunition, range, direction, target, execution. So, gunner, Sabo, front, tank, fire. Somewhere along the lines, the direction and range were moved to after the target description. So I would personally have said something like gunner, Sabo, tank, front, fire. I should add that 12 o'clock is a perfectly legitimate thing to say, and it is approved in the manual. But it's an awfully long-winded way of saying front. The identified and on the way calls by the gunner remain the same from 1961 as they do today. Similarly, the sensing description for a good shot in 1961 is the same as today: target. The other sensings, long, short, and doubtful, and lost, also remain today as they were 60 years ago. Now, what I really need is the FM from the 1980s, but I can't seem to find it online offhand. On a related question, some folks in comments from the last video were asking me if I'd read Team Yankee by Harold Coyle. I have. I read a number of his books. I think the heroes have a little bit too much plot armor and the opposition is a little bit too consistently stupid or incompetent. That said, the premise of the 10,000 was interesting. On the subject of techno-thrillers, I shall detour and tell you about what is undoubtedly the worst one of these I've ever read, Dark Rose by Mike Lunnon Wood. Here's a Cliff's Notes version, and Irish viewers will appreciate this. Arabs decide to hold Ireland for ransom in exchange for Palestine. Libyan Arabs who emigrated to Chile pretend to be Spanish students and overrun Ireland, in conjunction with the PLO, with the aid of tanks, APCs, and whatever else got smuggled in. And probably the most valid point in the book was that most Irish people couldn't tell one of their own vehicles from a foreign one. The Irish Defence Forces surrender without a fight. Ethna, the flagship, is scuttled in harbour. One Peacock escapes to the UK. A free Irish battalion remains in uniform. Instead of simply going around the corner of the Palestine and cracking heads, they also go to the UK. The first act of resistance is caused by an old man on a tractor who blocks the road of a Libyan convoy. They used to block me all the time. I have no idea why it wasn't considered a militia act against me. The Peacock goes around acting the pirate to any Libyan cargo vessels. When one cargo vessel shoots back, it is then reliant on an escorting British destroyer. So, for whatever political reason, the US, UK, etc. cannot take sides. They do, however, grant leaves of absence for any troops of Celtic descent, or who dated an Irish woman once, to go be mercenaries in effect. The British SAS finds the last remaining descendant of the High King Zatara, and she is declared Queen of Ireland and Commander-in-Chief of Celt Force. Some equipment, tanks, fighters, aircraft carrier battle groups, get reflagged under Irish military colours for the duration. Cue counter-invasion, general high-intensity conflict, Mullingar gets hit by some FAEs, no loss there, and the Free Irish Battalion, filled with bloodlust, takes no prisoners. End with victory parade to College Green. Good luck. Arc-TIE, T-Y-E, T-Y-I, T-I-E, sorry. He has heard an argument that one of the reasons that the Soviets pushed for the development of autoloaders was a manpower shortage. After World War II, they wanted to automate as much as possible. Is there any weight to this argument? That's a new one on me. I've heard to account for weakened loaders on the radioactive battlefield, which I think is a bit dodgy as well. The explanation, which makes most sense, is that they were simply trying to keep size and weight down. They are very definite advantages which exist no matter the conditions of the battlefield. Windwalker 57. Bob Semple may have designed the worst AFV of the war, but he almost hit on a good idea. Could an up-armoring kit for bulldozers, to be used as bulldozers, have been of use in World War II? The CBs, amongst others, might have bought 100 or so. The answer is sure. Caterpillar bulldozers, of course, were normally unarmored. They were usually the D4, the D6, and D7. They had army terminology like light tractor M1. However, a little over 100 were indeed locally equipped with armor. There appear to have been two general designs used in Europe, armored by the UK's Caterpillar importer, not by the military specifically. However, the US, of course, tended not to do things by half measures. If you were going to use a tracked armored bulldozer on the front lines, why not start with something tracked and armored, and equipped with cannon, and then stick the bulldozer blade on that? And the Sherman dozers proved extremely useful and successful. It similarly wasn't impossible to fit a cat with armor locally in the Pacific. This photo taken on Saipan. Most vehicles, of course, were unarmored. The best that would happen might be if a tree fell on the bulldozer, then the headache bar, that long beam which carried cabling over the top of the vehicle, could perform a protective function. The Slaven. Of all the tanks and SPGs which turned out to perform better than expected, which one and why? It's difficult to answer, but the M3 and M4 medium have definitely got to be up there simply because of the sheer variety of roles that the vehicle's chassis ended up performing. Designed as a gun tank, it turned into anything from artillery pieces to a beach recovery vehicle. Hilary Doyle's suggestion for this is the drilling, which in AFV terms is the SDKFZ 251/21. Though originally intended for anti-aircraft purposes, they discovered that the things were just plain scary to any opposition, even tanks, due to the incredible volume of fire, and troops were asking for as many as they could get. Dirk, what's the deal with the Sherman cone? Ever since Laserpig did a 30-minute video on this thing, I've been asked about it, and it's exactly what he said it was at the end. It's a brake, locking, and release fixture for shipping. Why he made a mystery out of it, I have no idea. Christopher Ryan, what's the feasibility of using third-party spotting to spot and derive solution for tanks in pre-prepared positions to fire through smoke or other concealment? For high explosive and machine gun fire, not improbable. Allow me to introduce you to DA Form 5517 and whatever the counterparts are in other militaries. It's the range card. It's actually interesting how many of these questions are being asked, and you realize when you dig into it, the Army has actually thought about them before. So when you settle into a new position, you're supposed to draw up a range card. I used to hate doing it, but you got it. So in it, you note the terrain features, and you can also place azimuth and range on these cards precisely so you can tell what's where on the battlefield without necessarily having good visibility to it. Now, normally this is for night, but it works just as well for smoke or anything else. In fixed fortifications, such as bunkers, this information may be painted directly onto the wall just below the embrasure. If there are avenue likelies of approach to be covered, they can be set up as target reference points. Thus, if the firing position gets smoked, it's still possible to have another position call out something like troops TRP3. You would then go to your range card, aim accordingly, and that would at least cause some caution to the target. In today's world, with more rapid and accurate artillery and mortars, though, the requirement to use armoured vehicles to do this is reduced. Gareth Fairlow wants to know which tank from the last 50 years or so would win a tug of war. Well, if you're going to exclude vehicles whose primary function includes tractive effort, such as ARVs, I have a strong suspicion that the answer would actually be the M1. It has 70 tons of weight pushing down on the tracks to provide grip, and the torque band for the turbine is very much in its favour when starting off. Tim Dalrymple. What modifications might have been made to RAM if the US had been forced to take it due to some problem with the M4? Probably not many. They'd have kept the machine gun turret because Americans love machine guns, at least initially. The real question is whether or not they'd have kept the 57mm. This was a weapon not in favour with either the armoured force or the tank destroyer branch, the former because of the small high explosive content of the shell, and the latter due to concerns about the smaller projectile losing too much velocity at range. Not to say that the gun wasn't considered. The best analogue for your question, I think, is the history of the M7 Light medium tank, which went from a 37mm through the 57mm to the 75mm in final production. I suspect that if they had to use RAM, the Americans would do the same thing as they did in M7 and just figure out how to stick the 75 onto it. Josh Conti. Why did the US drop development of a stabilized gun after the M4? If they couldn't come up with a dual-axis stabilizer for later design or updates, surely a single-axis stabilizer would have been better than nothing. The US was certainly well aware of the possibilities of dual-axis stabilization. In 1948, they imported into the US 2 Centurions for testing. One was a Centurion 2 with the Metrovic 2-axis stabilization system. Generally, they liked the system insofar as it did what it could within the bounds of its expectations and installation into Centurion. They concluded that they could not easily install the Metrovic system into a US tank design, it just wouldn't fit right. However, it seems that the US did indeed conclude that if they couldn't do the job right, they weren't even going to try. Even in the 1949 report on Centurion, they observed that the gun stabilization system only stabilized the gun. It did nothing for the input of data from a ballistic computer. The US had a number of systems in development at this point which were supposed to do something of that nature, of inputting the ballistic solution into the system. In 1955, Ordnance did a study on the merits of different types of stabilization system, and the conclusion was that they needed to develop a system which is effectively the system used in modern vehicles today. That the stabilization be applied to the sight, and that the gun would simply follow the sight as best it could, and be combined with an alignment trigger disconnect. So when a trigger is pressed, the gun doesn't fire unless and until the gun has caught up with and is aligned to the sight. By 1958, the US had developed a dual-axis stabilizer for the T-95 tank, which also automatically incorporated super elevation input from the rangefinder system. Of course, T-95 was a test engineering vehicle in the end, but it still took over a decade for the add-on stabilizer to be fielded to M60A1s. Now, in Josh's question, he observes that the Soviets had implemented dual-axis stabilization much earlier on T-55 and T-62. Interestingly, the year after the AOS started being fielded to the M60s, the US obtained some T-62s for testing, and they conducted a direct comparison test between the T-62, the older T-55, and the M60A1. Now, bearing in mind that these were tests of the installed system, so gun control equipment and vehicle suspension were also factors in addition to the basic stabilizer technology. But still, the bottom line is that as stabilized tanks went, the T-62's system sucked. It actually proved to be a little bit worse than the T-55s, the thinking being that it was probably due to the larger mass of the gun. The system itself seemed to be more or less identical. So from the US's perspective, it seems to have been that it was a combination of waiting for the right system, which was just around the corner, any day now, and putting money and effort into inferior stabilizers, which were about to be made obsolete, just wasn't a good idea. The problem is it just seems to all taken a lot longer than expected. Robert Naborny, I would direct your attention to the reports generated during the war as to why many tankers disabled the stabilizer in Shermans. With the exception of only a few units who swore by the stabilizer, the big problem was that nobody was properly trained on its operation and maintenance. When they took a sample unit and ran them through stabilizer training, suddenly they were all converts. The colonels and generals of Ordnance Branch of the future, who were LTs and captains in World War II, would have the same access to such investigative reports as we do now. Who the fuck is Alice? Reminds me of my college days and a Smokey song of that. Anyway, he wants to know, or she, what does a modern saber round passing overhead sound like? I have absolutely no idea. I have never been shot at by one. He also wants to know, in 2072, why tanks are no longer in existence. What happened to them in the 50 years prior to make them disappear? I have no idea. This sort of question has been asked before on Q&A, such as, can we invent power armor to make infantry as tough as tanks and more maneuverable? Unfortunately, any advances I can think of to non-tank type systems, such as power plant miniaturization, railguns or whatever, can be applied just as well to tanks, except at a larger scale, so the relative advantage of the tank will remain. The only situation I can think of might be when one side is so utterly overwhelming in capability. Let's say they completely dominate the skies or the orbitals with all-weather sustainable precision strike systems combined with targeting systems from the ground, that there is no longer need for a tank. But any country or planet which can make such a force probably can also make a tank for far cheaper to do the same job. In the various worlds of sci-fi books, from hammer slammers to bolos and cyber tanks, I can only recall encountering one postulation of tanks having been actively eliminated, and that was one of the Starfist books by Sherman and Cragg. In this, the last tank was the M1D7 Super Abrams of 2049, in service until at least 2052. What defeated it was the 75mm M72 straight arrow, no relation to the Chinese missile of the same name, which by its description was a shoulder-fired low-sat type hypervelocity guided kinetic energy missile capable of acquisition after launch from behind terrain obstacles. According to this future history, tankers threw in the towel and tanks were removed from the battlefield for 300 years. With no tanks to shoot at, M72s went out of service again, until someone decided to start a war with a new main battle tank, and had quite a bit of success, until the M72s went back into production. Now, I have some issues with this hypothesis, mainly that tankers just threw in the towel, to use the words in the book. And of course the premise is very similar to that which we've been hearing recently from Ukraine, but I reject this premise. I would refer you to my "No, the tank is not dead" video in the unlikely event that you haven't seen it. Another issue I have with the premise is that armored personnel carriers are apparently still considered viable in this hypothetical future, which seems a bit silly, as if you can kill a tank, you can probably kill an armored personnel carrier. Dave 077, question on archiving. I've talked about various things in the archives, what was deemed worthy of being archived and what was the process. What does it look like now? When my counterpart 100 years from now browses the archives, what sort of things are they going to find? It's an excellent question, and it is one that I have pondered upon myself. Back in the day, when making a copy was a deliberate effort, obviously not everything was recorded. On the other hand, it also meant that the first layer of filtering was already conducted for the historians. If something was in the archives, it was because somebody thought it was important enough to sit down with a typewriter. This includes transcripts of telephone calls between general officers. So, for example, when General Barnes telephoned General Devers to tell him that there was this new 76mm gun that they had invented, which they could put into Shermans, there was a stenographer listening in on the line, typing it down. I have the transcript on one of my written articles. See link in the text description below. Reports, telegrams, etc. would be sent to a physical archive and eventually would find their way to NARA or other such records collections such as regional archives or branch archives. However, today, everything is a matter of record. Now, I have no idea if VoIP calls between seniors are recorded somewhere or not, but everything sent in an email is stored on a hard drive or server somewhere, which worries me as a historian. If you're an office worker, think about the volume of short emails which you send on a daily basis. Sure, some of it is actually relevant, but if I'm in Afghanistan, I'm going to send an email to my buddy over in the S5 section asking if he wanted to go get lunch at the local national food stall in half an hour, and this was done on the SIPRNet because that's what we had, then that has become a communication of historical record. And a historian digging through the email archives is going to have lots of those sorts of things to dig through to find anything useful. There is going to be some very serious AI needed, which is going to be able to sort out the wheat from the chaff. Now, that said, there are still unit historians who will record things, but I haven't actually seen what they produce, so I can't tell you. On the plus side, test reports and research papers are still being created and are now placed online on sites like DTIC, and if you have access, NGIC. Not everything on DTIC is unclassified, but at least it tells you that the document exists and you can file a request for declassification. Christian B. Would I rather command an M1 Abrams in World War II or a Sherman in Iraqi Freedom? Well, for the main combat, definitely the M4 in Iraq. All the supporting assets on the other end of the radio are worth much more than the 40 stowed kills that you get in a modern tank, if you can get the 70-ton tank across any of the engineering bridges of the era. Besides, filling a 500-gallon fuel tank with 5-gallon cans every day doesn't strike me as being pleasant. No, I haven't read Clancy's Armored Cav book in years. I cannot give you an opinion because I simply can't remember it. Josh Nichols. Did my M1 tank have a name? Barely legal. The tank was already named when I joined the crew, in place of the previous LT who had been fired for inability to make a decision. My second tank, which I didn't have long enough to take a photo it seems, was a diplomatic incident. My first Bradley was Hang 'em High, which was on the vehicle when we received it as a hand-me-down. This was a pre-ODS in 2009 or so, and I believe at the time one of the oldest M3s in the Army. Sleep deprivation was the second Bradley, that was an ODS, but although I could have sworn I was a photograph of it taken somewhere, I cannot seem to find it. Ben Loughreen is curious about reconnaissance. From what he understands, armoured formations have a bit more in the way of mechanization than foot sluggers. True enough. Does this cause doctrinal changes for reconnaissance? Are there additional recon needs for an armoured formation that an infantry formation may not require? The US Army wrestled with this idea in the early days of mechanization in the 1930s. It was obvious that the higher speeds of armoured cars and greater limitations on mobility meant that it was necessary for a form of route reconnaissance to be performed before the armoured cars got there. To this end, very early in the development of the 7th Cavalry Brigade Mechanized, aircraft were added to the order of battle to determine roads, bridges and the likes, which the armoured vehicles would want to utilize or check out. Today we still have aircraft that can do the work, but also satellites. A division headquarters will have a bunch of folks whose job it is to take satellite and aerial photographs and try to translate that data into some sort of practical information for the recon guys on the ground. However, the basic concepts of reconnaissance don't change on the basis of your transport via tracks or LPC. Indeed, the basic concepts of tactics don't change at all either. The main difference is that instead of bounds of 10 to 30 meters, you're doing bounds of 300 to 500 meters. The principles, however, remain the same. John Zabala. Do I have any ambition of attaining the rank of general, considering I've made it as far as lieutenant colonel? Well, let's see if I make full bird first. I've only been an 05 for a year and a half. The minimum time and grade is 3 years. I have absolutely no idea where I rack and stack with my counterparts. The first order of merit list report for my new rank hasn't come out yet, at least not that I've seen. I am short 2 hard prerequisites for full colonel and a soft one. I haven't had a battalion command and I don't have a master's degree. I'm about halfway through the latter, and the former is out of my hands and sort of reflects a bit of my soft problem. I don't believe I'm well known amongst the various decision makers in Austin since I came in from out of state. And frankly, I'm not the sort of person to network well. I'm really not very sociable. Besides, I'm far from the flagpole in El Paso. On the plus side, I'm Advanced Operations Course Complete, which is a battalion command prerequisite, and a surprising amount of my colleagues are not. And Texas is converting from light to heavy, which means that my experience on tanks and Bradleys is both a bit rare in the state and useful for battalion command. So certainly full colonel is within reach, although I wouldn't like to place money on it. In the meantime, I'm not in a huge hurry to push the issue. I've got a couple of warfighters scheduled for the next year, and those are always fascinating to partake in and are excellent training. The last one I was plugged into a French division headquarters, although I don't expect anything as awesome this time around. Once I'm done with those, I might start nosing around a bit. We'll also see if I make one of the senior service colleges. I sent in my applications a couple of months ago. If approved, it's a step in the right direction. It'll also likely mean that my YouTube production will is near to stop for a year if that happens though. Climbing the greasy pole takes quite a lot of legwork, it seems. Lots of boxes to check and only about 5 years to do it in. Robert Allweiler observes that one of the casualties of the peace dividend was a lot of the next generation equipment, the development of which was killed off once the USSR collapsed. He would like a brief overview of these technologies. And I have to say, that's actually a very interesting question, which I think is probably worthy of a video of its own. I shall add it to the to-do list, somewhere after the US autoloaders, part 2 and maybe part 3, and in front of painting that bloody Chi-Ha and Chi-Ri that I've had on my waiting list upstairs for many, many months. And right, that's the end of that. Oh, by the way, people keep commenting on the bookshelves. I think they came from Crate and Barrel, because people want to know where the hell I got them. And the reason that they're such a mess is because those aren't books for show. I grab them routinely. Every day I'm putting something down. And that's, I put them back up eventually, but they're not about to fall down. There's no earthquakes here in Central Texas, at least if there are, we got some serious problems. And the wood is strong enough to hold. So there you go. Okay, that is that. I hope you found it interesting and informative. And I shall talk to you on the next one. Take care. More March.